Hi. So, welcome to Reading List 6B. So this would be about epistemological crises in the 20th and 21st century. And I start out the lecture notes, the overview for this with this joke, but I'll retell it. Because I think this is a joke that really sort of reflects the nature of epistemological crisis. So, a man comes home one day from work, and he finds his wife in bed with his best friend. And the friend says, "Hey man, don't get angry. After all, who are you going to believe? Me or your own eyes?" But so, the idea of this joke is that what counts as an authority, what counts as reliable, what counts as a good source of information becomes uncertain in the 20th century. So, now, in fairness, part of this is based on the incorrect supposition that at earlier points in history, epistemology had been reliable. So, epistemology, just to make clear, is how we know what we know. So this would be what counts as authority, what counts as evidence, what counts as reliable, what sorts of knowledges or what sorts of disciplines or understandings are considered legitimate as opposed to illegitimate sources of knowledge. So there is, for instance, an epistemology of science. There's an epistemology of religion. There's an epistemology of metaphysics. There's an epistemology of come up with another big one. There's an epistemology of literary analysis, for instance. So we've got all of these different ways of knowing and understanding the world, and in the 20th and 21st centuries, the major sort of intellectual crisis becomes what ways of knowing the world count as reliable. So, and again, a lot of this is tied into World War I. So you should have gotten this, I think, from last week, week 5, on the 20th century. A lot of this is tied into the crisis of World War I, which sort of throws into doubt for a lot of people whether or not things like traditional Christianity, European high culture, science, rationalism, the Enlightenment, art, all of this stuff that European civilization is built on, World War I throws that into question because all of a sudden you have one of the most brutal and devastating wars in the history of the world being waged by people who thought that they were civilized and thought that they were beyond barbarism. So this precipitates what we call the Modernist crisis. Now, the Modernist crisis has its roots in the late Victorian period, when people were starting to sort of question traditional understandings, traditional ways of looking at the world and understanding their place in it. But it really picks up steam with World War I, and the 20s and the early 30s are the high point of modernism. Essentially, what happens with modernism is a set of anxieties, a set of fears, and a kind of dread about the universe being meaningless, or about the position of humans in culture, in the world, being uncertain. So again, people are no longer sort of capable of unquestioning religious belief. Science is insufficient to explain everything. Culture has failed, and all of this stuff. And so people are very, very worried about this. And so we get, obviously, things like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which becomes this sort of attempt to pull together a number of cultural fragments into a new sort of cultural edifice, a new way of knowing the world through this sort of bricolage approach. This is fundamentally the issue for modernism, is that the ways that we have traditionally understood humanity's place in the world are no longer reliable. And so the anxiety, the concern, the fear is that we need to find something new to root human experience in. We need to find some way of making sense of our place in the universe and understanding what it is that we are supposed to be doing in culture. So this is for modernism, right? We get the sort of World War II period, really, which goes from about 1940 up through, well, I mean, World War II obviously ends in 1945, but by and large, we're looking at a period from about 1940 up through 1968, where we have a sort of interlude between the heyday of modernism before we get to postmodernism. And in this period, so we've got World War II years, and really from about 1945 to 1968, we've got three major intellectual trends in Britain. One is sort of happy, maybe a bit naive patriotism about sort of Britain's glorious victory in World War II. One is what we would call sort of kitchen sink realism, the angry young men. So these are people who are opposed to middle class values that they see as structuring a traditional Britain. They're sort of opposed to conservative ways of organizing society. And then we get the absurdists or the existentialists. And these are people who are really heavily influenced by French philosophy, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who are working in French existentialism or absurdism. And so we have that trend. People like Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, early Tom Stoppard plays. Forgive me, I know mostly drama people. But we've got this as our sort of third trend permeating. And then we get to 1968, which is a banner year in European history because we have, I mean, it's not a sort of clear-cut, like, boom, 68, now we're postmodern, but there's a series of sort of student protests and uprisings in Paris and in other European major cities. And in a way, this can be seen as the sort of starting point of the postmodern period, because it's really in the 70s and the 80s, 90s, through to today, that we have postmodernism. Now, postmodernism is primarily what I work on, so this is really my wheelhouse. Essentially, postmodernism is about skepticism. So, postmodernists acknowledge, for instance, that the modernist crisis was based on the flawed supposition that at some point prior to, say, 1880, 1890, there had been a stable epistemology, that there had been some sort of way of knowing the world that was accurate and that was true. So the modernists believe that's been lost. The postmodernists believe that that was always a lie. So postmodernists reject the idea that there is an overarching way of understanding the world or knowing the world or our place in it. And they argue instead that the only kind of truth that we can have access to is an individual truth based on our own subject positions. So I, as a middle-class, white, American male from the suburbs, pursuing a doctorate in English literature with a focus on contemporary British drama, whatever else. All of the things that go into my identity shape the way that I understand the world and my place in it, and no one else is exactly going to see the world the way that I do. So part of this is about radical sort of individualism. Part of this is about accepting that the way that one understands truth is socially conditioned. And part of this is about... So, some postmodernists accept that there might be what we call an ontological truth, a truth that exists, that simply is out there and is objectively true. Some postmodernists say no, there's no such thing. Some say there could be. But even those who acknowledge that there could be an ontological reality argue that there's no way that human beings can get to it. So even if there is something that is objectively true and is not conditionally based on one's subject position, there's no way that we as humans working from our own subjective positions can figure that out. So if it's true that, for instance, Hinduism is correct, if Hinduism is the truth and it's objectively true, there's no way that we as humans from our limited perspectives can ever know that it is true. All we can ever know is whether we believe that it's true. So this is fundamentally what postmodernism is all about, is questioning all of the ways that we try and make meaning for ourselves and throwing them into doubt. So we've got, broadly speaking, two epistemological approaches in the 20th century. We've got modernism, which is about attempting to find a new means of understanding our position in the world, and we've got postmodernism, which rejects the notion that there can be an effective way of understanding ourselves in the world. Modernism tends to have a lot of anxiety, it tends to have a lot of concern and fear about the decline of society and the sort of terror of meaninglessness. Postmodernism tends to be very playful, it tends to use irony, it tends to use sort of weird for the sake of weird, it tends to like contradictions and things like this as a way of sort of playing with meaning. So you've got ultimately these sort of two components, and most of this reading list is really going to be more about modernism, because modernist stuff is much easier to get a hold of. Part of the problem that the Norton anthologies have, and this is a sort of bit about the politics of anthology making, is that a lot of British postmodernists have pretty tight control over the copyright to their work, which is part of the reason why there's so much post-colonial writing in the 20th century Norton anthology, but very little that's properly postmodern, other than something like Stoppard's Arcadia. We're going to read a couple of things that are postmodern or semi-postmodern, but by and large we're going to be focusing on the modernist crisis, because that's what there's more in the anthologies for those.